In this section, we're going to be covering the update timers and the transitions that make the motion in this game occur. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the runtime update. So to run through from the start, the game loads through the load function, loading all these objects into the game. Then it runs the new game function that actually starts the game itself. This sets the score to 0, sets the game to being inactive. It resets and starts the player and the level, but it also adds this timer and this event listener. So the event listener is an inter-frame listener. It's something that can only be added to the runtime environment. So the runtime is a reference to the full game and how it's functioning on the back end. So we're adding to that an event listener that every time a new frame is entered, a new frame on the screen is drawn, we run a function that we have named update, which is here. So every frame on the screen that occurs, this function is then called. So let's go through this update function and see what it has. So as we went over in the last section, it has the update for changing the velocity for the player in either direction. So every frame it checks to see if the left button is held, and if so, it changes the velocity to the left. And if the right button is held, then it changes the velocity, adds 1 to the velocity, making it go right. The next step is the levels update location, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. So the first thing it does is it has a formula to determine what circle the level is on. So the circles that come by on the screen, this is determining which one was the last one that was activated. So it's 4, 5, 6. So as these hit the screen, it detects which one is currently active. The next thing it does is it checks to see if the values for the Y location of the level are within the range of the scoring method. So you'll notice you can't get a score in the beginning here because there is no line. That is determined by this function. This checks to see if it's within the boundaries of these lines. So from the start of the beginning of the line to the end up at the top. So this is just a very quick determination to figure out when it hits that limit and cuts off. That's this if sequence. If it is in that range, it sets the game to being active as true. So is active is determining that you are actually in the play scenario, in the situation that the game is playing. The next thing it does is finds the Y location of the player in context of the level. So at any point in time, this level is moving down. It's coming down at you. At any point, there is where this red circle is, where the line is intersecting with this blue line on the bottom. That is what this is determining. It's determining the Y location of this line, this giant line, where that Y location is. And we use that to check the line data that we create in this add data function to figure out where the X value is. So what we're trying to find out is the X and Y location on that line that's going across the screen, what the X and Y location is of the point where this red circle is. So that's what this Y location does, and once it detects the Y location, it finds if there is an X value for that location. So if there is an X location on this line, and if there is, it sets the X score, so the X location for the scoring point, to that data. So this is a pretty complex bit of game logic. You don't have to necessarily understand it on your first go. Just understand that we're checking to see if you're in the play area. If so, you're active. Then it gets the Y location on this line. It finds the up and down location where it is at this bottom point. And then it tells it the X location of that and sets that to X score on the level. We also have this debug object, this red circle. We're setting its X location to that same element, to this X score, just to ensure that it is showing up exactly where we'd expect it to. So that's the first step, the major step of the update location for the level. The other thing we're doing here is if you aren't in the bounds of the level, we're setting the is active to false. So we're saying to the game that it's false, you are not in the current gameplay setup. You are outside of the game's bounds. We also are moving the debug object off the screen, so we can tell immediately when the debug object is no longer in that draw phase. So when you can no longer score, it no longer shows up. And of course, this is only for our reference. It's not something that is used in the actual game's functionality. So next, let's take a look at the scores update, how this works in the update function. So after we do the level update, and we do the player update we covered before is where the X adds to the velocity, and then it checks if it's in the bounds, and if it isn't, it moves it to the bounds. The next thing we do is we check to see if the game is active. So this is that level function that we were talking about before of setting the active to true or false if it's in the range of those lines. If it is active, then it runs this function on the player, score difference. What score difference does is it determines if there is an X score, if there's an X location for the scoring variable. So if that red circle is on the screen, then it creates a variable in player named self.xDifference or player.xDifference, and that value is the distance between the player's X location and that red circle, the X location on the bottom of this line. So this number, this X difference, is the difference between this red point and the center of the player's object. So as they get closer, that number becomes lower. As they get further, their distance becomes further and the distance becomes higher. So that is the score difference function. Next up, we check to see if the player's difference, the difference between the player's location and that scoring point, if they are less than 100, so if you're less than 100 pixels away in either direction, then we add points. And to add points, the first thing we do is we determine how many points to add. So the variable we're using here is 100 minus the difference. So if you are 1 pixel away from the right spot, this would come out to 99. If you are 50 pixels away, then this comes out to 50, and so forth. So the further you are away, the lower this number is, the lower the value you get. And then it multiplies it by 10. So if you are exactly on the pixel you should be, you will get 100 minus 0 times 10. You will get 1,000 points. Whereas if you're 50 pixels away, you get 100 minus 50, making it 50, times 10, making it 500 points. So once we determine this, we add it to the score. So the score is a running total of all the points you've received. So we have the score equaling itself plus the new points that have been created this frame. Now keep in mind this runs every frame, so the player can potentially add points every frame if they stay on the line. Lastly, we have in this update function the updating of the foreground, its UI. So every frame we update the UI in the foreground. Let's take a look at the foreground. So we have this update UI. Right now there's only one UI update that occurs, and that is the text in the score.text object. So the self.score text is this text on screen. It's a display.newText, but the way Corona works, it doesn't auto-update a text object with a new variable name or new variable value. So if a variable changes, you have to tell the display on the screen to change it as well. So every frame, we tell it that the actual text in this text object is now the score rounded to 0 decimals. So the score actually has a decimal location. It has a potential decimal difference, and we don't want to show 144,070.237. We don't want to show decimals. The player's not interested in the decimals. So for the text shown on screen, we round that off. So this is updated every frame, so every frame you get a new score showing, and it consistently stays the same. And we see here if we change the rounding, let's say to 2, then it'll round it to the second decimal place, so we'll actually get up to 2 decimal points. Now I don't believe we're going to get any decimals right now because of the way this equation works, but if we did it, let's say divided by 10, so you only receive 1/10 of your points, then you'll start seeing here we have a decimal place. So let's go ahead and change that back to times 10 and set this back to 0. So that's the basics of the update function. Now let's take a look at the end game timer. So you'll see here in the new game function, we have a timer that performs the function end level after a certain amount of time. So the time that we're using is the length of the game, which was this thing we set up in the beginning, and it's in seconds. That times 1,000 because timers work in milliseconds, so 1 second is actually 1,000. So we have the amount of seconds times 1,000, making it 20,000 in this case. But then we're also adding an extra 3 seconds to the beginning and the end. So that is why when you play, there's a bit of a pause before the end game actually shows up. It doesn't show up the instant that the round is over. And this is just for the sake of making sure there's a little bit of breathing room before that menu pops up. So once this timer starts with the new game, it triggers this after, in this case, 23 seconds. And it runs the end level function. So this function we'll cover more later on. Next, let's take a look at the levels timer and transition. So in the start of the level, we have another timer, and this one is actually a transition. So this is the motion of the level. So the level is a giant display group. It's a whole set of images. It's all those lines and circles. And what we're doing is we're telling them all to draw in one giant group. We're telling that group to be in a negative location above the screen, so it's very high up above the screen. And then we're setting the time, the length of time it takes for that level to move from its current location to below the screen, so to actually make it move past the screen. And then we call this transition. So this transition is to the object of the level, which is all the circles and lines. We're telling its y value to be the length of the level, so we want it to move the full length of the level, which we've determined here. We're telling it that it's a delta movement, so we're not giving its actual new location, we're just telling it how much to move. And then we're giving it how long to do that, which is the level time which we set here. So we're telling it how long it should move, how far it should move, and that we're asking it to move this distance, not to this specific point. So that's the basics of the level transition. We're going to go ahead and go into the next section, which covers the scoring system for the game.